Nothing, the widow Marchette said, and laughed, the word ringing bright and cruel down the length of the great hall. You have inherited exactly nothing, my dear, and I confess I have never in my life enjoyed the reading of a will half so much. The Duke of Bexmoor, standing unnoticed in the shadow of the doorway with his hat still in his hand, saw the girl to whom this was said, and did not forget her for the rest of his life. Julian Ashcombe, 7th Duke of Bexmoor, had come to Raysbury Hall on a matter of business, a strip of disputed water meadow, a boundary his steward had quarrelled over for a decade, had been shown in by a flustered footman into the middle of a scene that had nothing to do with him. He should have withdrawn. A gentleman withdraws, but he stood in the doorway of the long-panelled hall, half in shadow, and he watched, because at the far end of it, before a fire that had not been lit generously enough to warm the room, stood a young woman in a plain grey morning gown who was being laughed at, and who was not laughing back, and who was not, either, weeping, who stood very straight with her hands folded and her chin level, and took the cruelty full in the face as though she had long practice at it. Around the widow clustered two daughters got up in a great deal more black crape than grief, and a solicitor turning his papers unhappily, and it was to the solicitor that the young woman finally spoke, in a low, clear voice. You are quite certain, Mr. Pruitt, my father left me nothing at all? The estate is entailed, Miss Wren, the solicitor said, not meeting her eyes. It passes with the title to a distant cousin. Everything not entailed, the furnishings, the plate, the moneys your late father left by the will made after his second marriage, to your stepmother and her daughters in trust. He cleared his throat. There is one item bequeathed to you specifically, a workbox, your late mother's workbox. It is noted here. A workbox, the widow Marchette repeated, and her daughters tittered. How very handsome, a whole workbox. You will want for nothing, Clara. You may sue your keep. She rose in a rustle of crape, magnificent and pleased. You may stay until the quarter day out of Christian charity, and then you must make your own way. As I always said, a girl of no fortune must. Your father indulged you shamefully. It ends now. And she swept toward the very door in which the Duke of Bexmoor stood in shadow, and did not see him until she was nearly upon him, and then she saw the cut of his coat, and the ducal signet on his hand, and the cold grey eyes fixed steadily upon her. And every drop of colour drained out of her handsome, triumphant face. Your Grace, she gasped, sinking into a curtsy so sudden it was nearly a collapse. Forgive me, we did not expect the honour. No, said the Duke. I don't imagine you did. His voice was very quiet, and it filled the whole hall. I have come about the water meadow. I find I have come at an interesting hour. He did not look at the widow again. He walked past her, unhurried, the length of the long hall, his boots loud on the bare boards. And he stopped before the young woman in grey, and he looked at her steady face, at the eyes that had not once dropped, at the ink stain he noticed, faint on the side of her right hand, the mark of someone who writes, and he bowed to her. He, the Duke of Bexmoor, before whom that whole room had just abased itself, bowed to the penniless girl in the corner as though she were a princess. Madam, he said, I beg your pardon for intruding on private grief. I am Bexmoor. He straightened. May I know your name? Clara Wren, your Grace, she said. Her voice did not shake, though he could see what it cost her. You need not trouble to be kind. I am quite used to it, and I would rather not be pitied by a stranger, however grand. I am not being kind, said the Duke, and I do not pity you in the least. Pity is for the weak, and I have just watched you take a public cruelty standing up straighter than most men take a compliment. Something almost like the ghost of a smile touched his hard mouth. I don't waste pity on a woman with a spine like a cavalry sabre. Now, whose is that ink on your hand? Clara looked down at her own hand, startled, and then back up at him. Mine, your Grace. I write. Copy. My father's correspondence, these last years when his sight failed him, his accounts, his letters to the tenants. A flush touched her pale cheek. It is nothing, a daughter's duty. His accounts, the Duke repeated slowly. He was very still. Behind him, at the far end of the hall, the widow Marchette had gone quite silent, and was watching with the fixed dawning fear of someone who has just realized the ground beneath her may not be as solid as she believed. You kept your late father's accounts, and his correspondence, for how long? 6 years, your Grace, since my eyes proved better than his. Then, said the Duke of Bexmoor, turning at last, without haste, to fix the solicitor with a look that made that unhappy man drop his papers altogether. "I should be very much obliged, Mr. Pruitt, if you would tell me why a man who employed his own daughter to keep his books for 6 years is said to have died, leaving that daughter nothing, and I should be even more obliged if someone would fetch me the workbox." The solicitor did not answer him at once. He looked from the Duke to the widow and back again, and in that look was the whole miserable history of a small man who has done a great man's dirty work and finds, too late, that a greater man than either has walked into the room. It fell to Clara to break the silence. She had risen from the hard chair, and though her face was still pale, she stood as she always stood, straight-backed, her folded hands the only sign of what the hour had cost her. "Your Grace need not trouble, Mr. Pruitt," she said quietly. "I can answer for the accounts myself. I kept them because my father wished it, and I kept them faithfully, and there was never in 6 years a farthing out of place in any book I balanced, which Mr. Pruitt knows. For he checked them twice a year and signed each time that they were sound." She looked at the solicitor, and the solicitor looked at the floor. "As to why my father is said to have left me nothing, I cannot answer that, for I have never seen the will until this hour, nor been told a word of its making. I signed nothing. I was told nothing. I was called in to hear it read this morning as one calls in a servant to hear her notice." A faint bitterness touched her voice for the first time. "Perhaps that should have told me what to expect." The Duke of Bexmoor listened to this, and something in his hard face grew harder still, not against her, but on her behalf, a cold anger banking itself down for later use. He had come into this hall a stranger with no stake in its quarrels, and he found himself in the space of 10 minutes taking a side, wholly and without reservation, and he was a man who had learned in a long hard life to trust exactly that instinct, the one that spoke before his interest did. "Miss Wren, how long has your father been dead?" 3 weeks, Your Grace." "And his sight, you said his sight failed. When?" 6 years since. It came on him gradually and then all at once after a fever. He could see shapes at the end and light, but he could not read a line nor sign his name without a hand to guide the pen." She lifted her chin a fraction. "My hand, most often. I guided the pen he signed his letters with. I do not say it to make a claim. I say it because Your Grace has asked, and I have never in my life learned the trick of saying anything but the truth, which my stepmother has often told me is my chief failing as a woman." "It is not a failing," said the Duke. "It is the rarest thing in England, and I have spent a fortune learning how rare." He turned the thought over, and his voice when he spoke again was very deliberate. "A man whose sight has failed for 6 years. A will made, you tell me this, to the solicitor, after his second marriage, which I take to be more recent than his blindness. A will disinheriting the only child of his first marriage, the daughter who kept his books and guided his pen." He let the silence stretch until the solicitor was visibly sweating. "Tell me, Mr. Pruitt, when your late client set his name to the will you read this morning, the will leaving everything to his widow and her daughters, and to his own blood a workbox whose hand guided the pen." The solicitor made a small strangled sound. The widow Marchette had gone very still indeed. "You need not answer," the Duke said pleasantly, which was somehow far worse than if he had shouted. "I see the answer in the lady's face. I only wished us all to have the question clearly before us. A blind man's signature is a delicate thing, Mr. Pruitt. It wants witnesses of unimpeachable character, and a very clear account of who read the document aloud to him, and who held the pen, and whether what was read to him was, in fact, what he signed. I should think a court would want to know all that, before it turned an honest young woman out of doors on the strength of it, should not you?" There was a reason, though Clara could not have guessed it, that the Duke of Bexmoor had reacted as he did to a young woman standing straight-backed, while she was called nothing, a reason that went deeper than gallantry. He had been once, a very long time ago, a second son, before a brother's fever made him heir, and then a father's death made him duke, and in the years when he had been merely the Honourable Julian Ashcombe, of no particular consequence, he had learned exactly how the world treats a person it has decided does not signify. He had watched hostesses look through him at balls. He had watched his own aunt introduce his elder brother to every heiress in the room and forget his name at the door. He had learned young what it was to stand in a bright hall and be counted as nothing. And though a brother's death and a title had long since that world behind him, he had never once forgotten the taste of it, and he never could see it done to another person, in any hall, without something old and cold waking in him. So when he stood in the doorway of Braesbury Hall and watched a girl in grey take a public cruelty standing up straight, he had not seen a stranger. He had seen, across 20 years, a version of himself who had not been rescued by an accident of inheritance, and had had to find her own straight back to stand on. And he had decided, before he had crossed the hall, before there's any workbox or any deed, that whatever happened in that room, Clara Wren would not walk out of it into the life he had so narrowly escaped. And it was then, into that ringing silence, that the Duke had asked for the workbox. Clara had not understood at the time why he asked. The workbox was fetched, at length, by a frightened maid, a plain old thing of rosewood, worn smooth at the corners, its lid a little warped, the last poor legacy of Clara's dead mother. The stepmother's daughters had already laughed at it once. The Duke of Bexmoor did not laugh. He asked Clara's leave to look at it, and she gave it mystified, and he set it on the long table in the cold hall and opened it, and there were the ordinary things: a paper of needles, a card of buttons, a thimble worn thin, a hank of grey silken beneath the tray, where such boxes always have a shallow compartment for scissors and reels. The Duke's careful fingers found that the floor of the compartment did not sit as it should. He looked up at Clara. "You have never had cause to open this fully?" "It was my mother's," she said quietly. "I have kept it as she left it. I sew from it. I have never, it did not seem mine to take apart." "With your leave," said the Duke, and at her nod he pressed gently in the two corners, and the false floor of the compartment lifted, and beneath it, folded small and yellowed with years, lay papers. There was a silence in the hall you could have heard a needle drop into. The Duke did not touch them. He turned the box so that they faced Clara. "They are yours," he said. "I will not be the first to read what your mother hid for you, but I will stand here while you do, if you wish it, so that no one in this room may afterwards say they were not there." Clara Wren reached into her mother's workbox with an unsteady hand and drew out the papers and unfolded them, and Reed and the Duke of Bexmoor, watching her face, saw the colour come and go in it, saw her lips part, saw her sink at last into the hard chair by the cold hearth as her knees gave way. When she looked up, her grey eyes were bright with tears she was too proud to let fall. "It is my mother's marriage settlement," she said, in a voice gone thin with shock, and in a deed, her own portion that she brought to the marriage. £3,000 settled on her soul and separate use, and after her, upon her issue, upon me, not upon my father at all, and not, therefore, she looked up, not therefore his to give away in any will, and a house, a small house in the town of Alderworth, that was her mother's before her, hers, and mine. She pressed the papers to her breast exactly over her heart and drew a long shaking breath. "My father never told me. He cannot have known, or he forgot his sight. These last years his mind wandered." Her voice broke at last, and she mastered it. "I am not penniless. I have been sitting in this house being told I am nothing, and all the while my mother left me, she left me." "She left you enough," said the Duke of Bexmoor gently, "to walk out of this house tomorrow and never be at any person's mercy again as long as you live." And then he turned, and this time he did look at the widow Marchett, and his face was not gentle at all. "Mr. Pruitt," the Duke said, without raising his voice, "you will take those papers into your keeping tonight, and you will verify them, and I think you will find them entirely in order, for I have seen a great many settlements in my time, and I know a sound one when it lies open on a table. And when you have verified them, you will oblige me by inquiring rather closely into how it came to be that a marriage settlement securing £3,000 and a freehold house to this young woman was overlooked in the reading of her father's estate, overlooked by a solicitor, overlooked in favour of a widow and her daughters." He let the words sit in the cold air. "I make no accusation. I am a stranger here, and it is no affair of mine, but have a very good memory and a very long reach, and I should be sorry, I should be extremely sorry, madam." He turned the full weight of those cold grey eyes upon the stepmother, who had gone the colour of tallow, to learn that anyone in this room had known of these papers, and hidden them, and stood before that fire and laughed at their rightful owner, and told her she owned nothing but a workbox. "Because concealing a deed from its heir is not cruelty, madam. Cruelty is merely ugly. That is a crime, and it has a name, and men have hanged for smaller." The widow Marchett opened her mouth and shut it, and opened it again, and no sound came out. One of the daughters had begun, quietly, to cry. The solicitor was gathering the papers with hands that trembled, and the look he gave the widow across the table told Clara, and told the Duke, everything that needed telling about who had known what, and when. The Duke stayed only long enough to see the papers safely into Mr. Pruitt's satchel, and to hear the solicitor stammer his assurances that they should be lodged that very night at the county registry and nowhere else. Then he took up his hat, and before he went he did one more thing that Clara Wren would turn over in her mind for many nights after. He crossed the hall to her a second time. The widow and her daughters shrank back against the wall as he passed them, as though the very draught of his passing might scorch. He stopped before the girl in grey, and he lowered his voice so that only she could hear it, and he said, "You do not need me, Miss Wren. I want that understood between us, now, before another word is ever spoken. In an hour you will be a woman of independent means with a house of your own and no living soul with any hold upon you. Whatever any person says or does from this day, you may walk out of any room in England on your own 2 feet and want for nothing. I have not rescued you. Your mother did that years ago, with a false flaw and a great deal of foresight, and you have done the rest yourself by keeping your head when a lesser woman would have wept. I have merely opened a box." Something moved behind the cold grey of his eyes. "I say it so that if I should ever have occasion to call upon you again, and I think I may, you will know it is not a beggar come to your door, and you may send me away with a clear conscience. Good day to you, Miss Wren." And he bowed to her a second time as deeply as the first, and was gone. And Clara stood in the great cold hall with her mother's papers pressed to her heart, and the whole ruined tableau of her stepmother's triumph collapsed to ash around her, and found that of all the astonishing things that had happened in that hall in the last hour, the one she could not stop thinking of was the low even voice of a duke telling her that she did not need him. The days that followed were strange ones at Raysbury Hall. The widow Marchett, who had ruled that house for 6 years, found the ground gone from under her all at once. Mr. Pruitt would no longer take her calls. The £3,000 she had quietly folded into her own trust was called back out of it with a letter from a London firm so cold and so exact in its knowledge of every date and every transfer that she understood, reading it, that the Duke of Bexmoor had set clever men to work, and that they had missed nothing. The house at Alderworth passed to Clara clean and clear, and the servants of the hall, who had watched for 6 years and said nothing, began as servants do. When the wind changes to be markedly kinder to Miss Wren and markedly slower to answer the widow's bells, so that the last week Clara spent under that roof was of all things the gentlest she had known there since her father's sight had failed, she did not gloat. She packed her few possessions and her mother's workbox with her own hands, and on the morning of her going the widow Marchett came to the door of the small back room that had been Clara's, and stood there in the doorway, and for a long moment neither woman spoke. "You will make me the talk of the county," the widow said at last. Her handsome face had aged years in a fortnight. "The Duke will see to that. He as good as promised it in the hall. The Duke will do nothing but the law," Clara answered, folding a shawl. "The talk you have made yourself, madam, over 6 years, in front of every soul who ever heard you speak to me. I have not said one word against you, and I do not intend to. I find I do not need to. You have been your own witness the whole time." She looked up. "I do not hate you. I thought I would when I had the means to, but I find I only pity you a little, for a woman who could stand before a cold fire and laugh at a motherless girl was never a happy woman to begin with. Whatever fortune she thought she had, keep the plate, keep the furnishings. My father left them to you, and I will not fight over silver. I have my mother's box and my mother's name in my own 2 hands, and that is a richer inheritance than anything in this house, and I am only sorry it took me until this week to know it." She tied the last knot in her bundle. "Good morning, madam. I do not think we shall meet often," and she carried her workbox out through the great door and down the steps and into the carriage the Duke of Bexmoor had, with perfect correctness and no message at all, quietly sent to convey Miss Wren wherever she wished to go, and the widow Marchett stood in the doorway of her own grand house and watched a girl she had called nothing drive away with the calm of a queen, and did not, then or ever after, entirely understand how it had happened that she had won the will and lost everything else. The town of Alderworth was not accustomed to dukes, and the town of Alderworth got rather more of one, that summer, than it had bargained for. The Duke of Bexmoor's first visit had been under the flag of business. The second he made no pretense about. He came on a market morning and found Clara at her table with 3 tradesmen's ledgers open before her and a queue of anxious townsfolk waiting on her verdict. And rather than send them away, he sat down on the settle by the door, this duke, and waited his turn like any other petitioner, to the paralyzed astonishment of the draper and the wheelwright and the widow Hartle who kept the pie shop, and could never make her farthings come right. He watched Clara work. He had commanded men who were called geniuses of finance, London men in black coats who advised the Crown, and he sat in a small parlour in Alderworth and watched a girl in a plain gown untangle a wheelwright's 3 years of muddled credit in the space of a quarter hour. Gently, so that the man went away not humiliated but relieved, understanding for the first time where his money had gone and how to keep it, and the Duke of Bexmoor thought that he had never in his life seen anything he admired more. "You are staring, your grace," Clara said, when the last of them had gone, without looking up from her figures. "The whole town will remark it. You will ruin my custom. They will think I have grand connections and put up my fees." "You should put up your fees," said the Duke. "You are worth 10 times what these good people pay you, and you know it." "They are worth what they can pay," Clara said, "and a fair reckoning does not change with who is asking. That was the first thing my father taught me, before his eyes failed, that the whole of honesty is in keeping the same measure for the great and the small. I mean to keep it." She set down her pen and looked at him at last, and there was the faintest colour in her cheek. "Which is why I must ask you, your grace, plainly, and forgive me if it is impertinent, what a duke is doing sitting on my settle on a Tuesday, twice in a fortnight, watching me add up a pie-woman's farthings. It cannot be for the water meadow. You have never once mentioned the water meadow." "No," the Duke admitted. "I confess I have entirely lost interest in the water meadow. My steward is bewildered by it." He turned his hat in his hands, and Clara, watching, saw with astonishment that the Duke of Bexmoor, before whom her stepmother had crumbled like a sandcastle, there was no other word for it, nervous. "I have been trying," he said, "to find a way to court a woman who has told me to my face that she does not need me, and who is entirely right, and whom I would not for the world make into another person's charity by seeming to pity her. It is the most difficult thing I have ever attempted. I have led men into cannon fire with less trouble." He set the hat down. "So I have decided to stop being clever about it, because I am not clever about it, and simply to come and sit on your settle and watch you work, until you grow so accustomed to my being there that you begin to think of the room as empty without me. That is my whole strategy. I have no other. I merely wished you to know, so that you did not think me a fool sitting there for no reason. I am a fool sitting there for the plainest reason in the world." Clara Wren looked at the Duke of Bexmoor across her small table, and something in her chest, that had been locked and guarded since the day her father's sight had failed and the laughter had begun, turned quietly over, like a key. "That," she said slowly, "may be the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me, and I keep accounts. I know what honesty is worth." She picked up her pen again, but she did not write. "You may sit on the settle, your grace," she said, and her voice was not quite steady, "on Tuesdays. But you must be quiet, and you must not put up my fees, and you must not ever tell these people who you are, for they will not bring me their ledgers if they think a duke is listening, and their ledgers are my living. And my living is the whole of why I'm able to sit here and consider whether I might one day like a duke on my settle at all." She looked up at him, and she smiled the first full smile he had ever had from her, and it changed her whole grave face like sun coming over a grey field. "Tuesdays. We shall see about the rest." And so it was Tuesdays all that summer, the Duke of Bexmoor on the settle by the door with his hat on his knee, quiet as promised, while Alderworth brought its tangled figures to the girl who set them right. And the town grew so used to the tall silent gentleman that they stopped remarking him at all, and the widow Hartle would sometimes hand him a still warm pie without a word as she went out, and he would eat it, this Duke, sitting on a settle in a market town, waiting for a woman who did not need him to decide that she might, after all, want him. And when at last, at summer's end, he stood in that parlour and asked her plainly, and she put her ink-stained hand into his and said yes, because you bowed it, surprised not one soul in Alderworth, who had all known for months exactly what the quiet gentleman on the settle was waiting for, and had all, to a person, been quietly rooting for him to get it. He had known, riding home from Raysbury Hall that first grey afternoon with the boundary dispute entirely forgotten, that he was in trouble. He was a man who had spent 15 years being courted by the loveliest and most fortunate young women in 3 kingdoms, all of them schooled from the cradle to catch a duke, and not one of them had ever once looked at him the way Clara Wren had looked at that solicitor. As though the truth mattered more than what it cost her. He had thought, perhaps, that the feeling would fade with distance and business and the ordinary crowding of a duke's life. It had not faded. It had grown week upon week, through every Tuesday on that settle, until the great echoing rooms of Bexmoor Court seemed emptier when he was in them than her small bright parlour did when he was not. So he had asked her at summer's end. And she had said yes because you bowed and the whole of Alderworth had rejoiced, and now there remained only the matter of doing the thing properly, which the Duke of Bexmoor was determined to do so well that no tongue in England should ever be able to say the new Duchess had been anyone's rescue or anyone's charity. The wedding morning was a bright one, and half the town of Alderworth crowded the small churchyard to see the girl who had set their ledgers right go up the path on the arm of a duke. She wore no diamonds. She had asked for none, and the Duke, who understood her by now better than she sometimes liked, had given her instead the one thing she would keep. Her mother's marriage settlement, the very paper from the false floor of the workbox, framed in plain oak, so that the deed which had freed her hung ever after in her own bedchamber, where she might see it each morning and remember that she had come to him as no man's charity, but as a woman with an inheritance of her own. The widow Hartle of the pie shop wept in the front pew. The wheelwright, whose credit Clara had untangled, gave the bride away, there being no other man living with a better claim to the honour, and the Duke of Bexmoor, standing at the altar of a country church his ancestors would never have deigned to enter, watched his bride come up the aisle with her chin level and her back straight, exactly as she had stood in that cold hall being called nothing, and thought that he had never in his life seen a thing so worth the whole of his fortune to protect. They were married in the small church at Alderworth, at Clara's asking, and not in the great minster where Bexmoors had wed for 200 years. She kept the house in the town all her life and never sold it, and she did not, whatever anyone expected, give up her ledgers, though she gave up the fees in the end and kept the books of the town's poor for nothing, which the town understood to be the greatest compliment a duchess could pay it. And she kept her mother's plain rosewood workbox on the writing table in the great library at Bexmoor Court, worn corners and false floor and all, where any grand guest who asked was told the whole story of it, of the will that left her nothing, and the laughter by the cold fire, and the papers folded beneath the needles, and the Duke in the doorway who had bowed to a girl worth, so far as anyone in that room then knew, precisely nothing at all. As for the widow Marchette, she found the county a colder place than she had left it. The tale of the concealed deed went round the drawing-rooms of 3 parishes, for such tales always do, and the doors that had opened to a wealthy widow closed to a woman who had cheated her own stepdaughter and been caught at it by a duke, and her 2 daughters, who had tittered at the workbox, found their laughter had cost them dear in a marriage market where a family's honesty is quietly weighed. They were not ruined. Clara would not have it when the widow, humbled at last and reduced in circumstance, was obliged some years later to write and ask a favour of the very stepdaughter she had scorned. The new Duchess of Bexmoor answered the letter, with a small settled allowance and 3 cool lines and no more. She did not gloat, for gloating was the widow's habit and not hers, and she had discovered that the sweetest revenge upon a cruel person is simply to become someone they can no longer touch. But she never received the woman under her roof, and the widow Marchette lived out her days on the quiet charity of the girl she had told owned nothing, and understood, at leisure every day, precisely how the account had come to balance so. And the Duke of Bexmoor, who had ridden to Raysbury Hall about a strip of water meadow and ridden home having quite forgotten it, used to say, in later years, when some earnest young men asked him how a duke ought to choose a wife, that he had only one piece of advice worth giving. Watch how she stands when someone tells her she is nothing. The fortune can be lost, he would say, and the beauty fades, and the connections turn to dust. But a woman who takes a cruelty standing up straight will stand up straight beside you your whole life through, and that, my boy, is the only inheritance worth marrying. And then he would look across the room at his Duchess, ink on her hand, and the books of the parish poor balanced fair beneath it, And she would look back at him with that grave face that broke like sun over a grey field when she smiled, and neither of them, to the very end of a long and happy life, ever forgot the day he crossed a cold hall and bowed to a girl in a corner with a workbox, before he knew of any reason under heaven to do it, and, by that single bow, chose the one woman in all of England who would love him for the man beneath the title, and not the title at all.